paragliding over the ocean, enjoying the view. A school of fish leapt from the water below, followed by something much larger, jaws snapping shut. The paraglider dipped suddenly, caught in a gust, plummeting toward the sea, straight for the waiting orca. Two predators converged, but only one would survive. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin the orca attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe, click the like button, and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Now let's move on to the case. Dr. Emma Carter gripped the edge of her boat as it cut through the glassy waters of the Strait of Georgia, the early morning fog still thick in the air. The shoreline of Vancouver Island was barely visible in the distance, a faint outline of jagged rocks and towering trees just beginning to take shape as the sun rose behind it. She could hear the gentle splash of the boat's wake, the only sound against the quiet hum of the engine. She was alone, out here on the vast ocean, far from the bustle of the small town where she had rented the boat for her research. Emma had spent the last few weeks mapping out the migratory patterns of the local orcapods, her passion for marine biology driving her to study the whales in their natural habitat. Her equipment was simple but effective: a GPS tracker, a satellite, phone, and a handful of scientific tools to measure water temperature and salinity. Emma couldn't help but smile as she looked out over the calm sea. The water stretched endlessly in every direction, the horizon an unobstructed line of blue. She'd always loved the ocean, its power, its mystery, the way it could calm a troubled mind or provoke a deep primal fear. And for her, it had always been about the orcas, those magnificent, intelligent predators. They were the focus of her research, and though she knew how dangerous they could be, Emma felt a deep respect for them. As she adjusted the antenna on her GPS tracker, she noticed a faint shadow under the water, a dark form moving swiftly beneath the surface. She felt a rush of excitement. Orcas were often seen here, though their migrations were not always predictable. She'd heard stories from local fishermen about their encounters, how the whales could be as graceful as they were terrifying. Emma keyed in her coordinates, knowing that the data she collected today could add valuable information to her research. She moved the boat slowly, trying to get a better look. There, in the distance, the unmistakable dorsal fin of an orca broke the surface. Emma's pulse quickened. She had seen orcas before, of course, countless times even, but each encounter still filled her with awe. She pulled out her camera, steadying herself as she zoomed in on the pod. There were more of them now, at least 3, moving in sync through the water. Beautiful, she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the sound of the engine. She marveled at how effortlessly they cut through the water, sleek and powerful, their movements an intricate dance of life and survival. She continued to watch the pod, her mind already running through the data she needed to collect. The GPS tracker beeped softly in her hand, confirming that she was close enough to get a good reading. She wasn't just an observer today, she was a researcher. But as she reached for the dial on her equipment, a shift in the orca's behavior caught her attention. One of the whales veered away from the group, swimming at an unusual angle, its movements sharp and purposeful. Emma furrowed her brow, instinctively, raising her binoculars to get a closer look. The whale's black and white markings stood out starkly against the deep blue of the ocean. At first, she thought it was just a quirk of the pod's movement. Orcas were known to display unusual behavior, sometimes swimming in erratic patterns or changing direction quickly, but as the orca swam closer, Emma's sense of unease began to grow. The creature wasn't moving like the others. It wasn't graceful, no longer part of the synchronized group. Her thoughts were interrupted when the orca surfaced just a few yards from her boat. Emma's heart skipped a beat. The whale was close, closer than she'd ever seen one. It stared at her with its piercing black eyes, its massive body slicing through the water like a living shadow. "Easy there," Emma muttered to herself, trying to maintain her composure. She instinctively reached for the boat's throttle, prepared to speed away if necessary. But the orca didn't retreat. Instead, it seemed to circle, its movements growing more deliberate. The rest of the pod had dispersed, vanishing beneath the water, leaving only this one orca. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The silence between her and the whale was deafening, and despite her scientific training, a creeping sense of fear began to settle over her. Orcas were apex predators, capable of stunning acts of intelligence and violence. The stories she had heard from locals and fishermen started flooding her mind. Stories of boats capsized by curious pods, of boats struck by the sheer force of an orca's tail. She swallowed hard, trying to push the growing anxiety from her chest. "It's probably just curious," she whispered to herself. She had read about orcas approaching boats before, but never with such an ominous sense of intent. Suddenly, with a flash of black and white, the orca lunged beneath the boat. Emma barely had time to react as the entire vessel jolted violently. The engine sputtered, and for a moment the boat seemed to lift from the water before crashing back down. Emma was thrown off balance, her body slamming into the side of the hull. She gripped the edge of the boat, her heart pounding in her ears. The water around her churned with the force of the orca's tail, a slap that sent waves crashing over the boat's sides. Emma gasped, struggling to keep her footing. Her mind raced, 1,000 thoughts flashing through her head. She needed to get control of the boat to get away from the pod, but as she glanced back, her worst fear was realized. The orca wasn't alone anymore. The pod had returned, surrounding the boat, their sleek bodies gliding through the water with terrifying precision. Emma's breath quickened, her pulse hammering in her chest. She tried to restart the engine, but it was no use. The boat was dead in the water, listing to one side as the orcas circled. They were getting closer, closer than she had ever imagined an orca could be. "Get back," she screamed, her voice trembling. She knew it was pointless. The orcas weren't going to listen to her. The boat rocked violently again, and Emma was thrown to the floor. Panic surged through her as she scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking. She couldn't think. She had to act. The next moments happened in a blur. The boat lurched as the orcas began to strike it with increasing force, their tails smacking the hull with bone-crushing strength. The sound of splintering wood filled her ears as the boat tilted dangerously to one side. She didn't have time to think. In a blur of panic and adrenaline, Emma dove over the side of the boat into the water. The cold hit her like a slap and she gasped, struggling to stay afloat. Her body immediately began to numb from the icy water, but she didn't stop. She swam frantically, trying to put distance between herself and the pod, but the water was alive with the orca's movements. She could feel them beneath her, their enormous bodies moving with terrifying precision. Emma tried to keep her head above the water, her breathing shallow and fast. She knew she had to get to safety, somewhere, but the ocean felt vast and unforgiving, and the distance to shore seemed endless. In the distance, she thought she saw the outline of a boat, a potential rescue. But the orcas were still circling, their dark fins cutting through the surface, with purpose. Emma's heart raced. She had no choice but to keep swimming, knowing that her survival depended on her ability to outpace the predators in the water. The orcas, it seemed, weren't just circling. They were watching, waiting for their next move. And as Emma swam, struggling to keep her mind from slipping into panic, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer just an observer of the ocean's creatures. She had become a part of their world, a world where survival was uncertain, and the predator was always just below the surface. Emma's heart was still racing as she struggled to keep herself afloat in the freezing water. The boat had capsized, and now she was alone, surrounded by the churning ocean. Her breaths came in quick, ragged gasps, her body already starting to ache from the cold. The water wasn't just cold, it was biting, as if the very ocean wanted to pull her under. Her thoughts were a blur of panic and disbelief. She had to get out of here, get to shore somewhere, anywhere. But all she could hear was the sound of splashing, the echoes of massive bodies moving just beneath the surface. The pod was still circling. Her legs kicked frantically as she tried to keep herself above water, her hands clawing at the surface. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was no sign of the boat. It had been completely flipped over, its hull now a broken, empty shell. The orcas had rendered it useless in a matter of seconds. The thought hit her hard. She had no escape now. The pod had spread out, forming a loose semicircle around her, their dark forms moving in and out of her vision, always just beneath the surface. She could hear the low rhythmic splash of their tails, their movements deliberate and slow. They weren't rushing to strike. No, this was something else, something she didn't understand. She could see their eyes now, those dark, intelligent eyes tracking her every move. It felt like they were studying her, learning her. Emma tried to remain calm, tried to force the rising panic from her chest, but it was impossible. The water was colder than she had imagined, and her muscles were beginning to stiffen from the shock. She knew she wouldn't last long in this condition. Her only chance was to get out of the water before exhaustion claimed her. She kicked harder, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of rescue. The fog was still thick, and the shoreline seemed impossibly far away. She could barely make out the outline of the island in the distance. Her mind screamed for her to swim toward it, but a part of her knew that swimming in the open water like this, alone, exposed, was a death sentence. She glanced back. The pod was closer now, their black and white bodies cutting through the water in a deadly dance. She froze. One of them, the largest of the group, was coming toward her. It moved with such speed and grace that for a brief moment, Emma thought it was just a shadow passing beneath her. But then it breached the surface, its massive body arcing through the water in a sleek, terrifying display of power. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the tension in the water. The whale was coming straight for her, and it wasn't slowing down. No, please, Emma whispered, her voice trembling as she frantically tried to swim away. Her hands pushing the water, her arms already burning with the effort. But the orca wasn't stopping. It surged forward, its tail flapping the water with incredible force, sending waves crashing around Emma. The water churned violently as the orca reached her, its sleek black and white body slicing through the surface like a weapon. Emma ducked beneath the water, her breath caught in her throat. She kicked hard, trying to put distance between herself and the massive predator. But she was too slow. Just as she thought she might make it, a shadow moved beneath her, and the next thing she knew, the orca was right there, gliding just inches from her body. She could feel the cold rush of water as the orca's tail passed by, its power so immense that it nearly pulled her under. She kicked harder, desperation now overtaking reason. Her lungs burned for air, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Then out of the corner of her eye, she saw another dorsal fin. This one was closer, and its size sent a shiver through her. The pod had closed in. They weren't just following her, they were surrounding her. "Please, please, God," she murmured under her breath, her eyes darting in every direction as she swam frantically. Her hands were numb now, but she had to keep moving. She had to outlast them. The orcas didn't seem to be in a rush. They were moving with precision, not chasing her in a frenzy, but calculating each movement deliberate as though they were playing with her. Emma had heard about orcas working together, coordinating their attacks with stunning intelligence, but seeing it firsthand, it was unlike anything she could have imagined. She had no idea how many there were now. 4, 5, more? They seemed to be everywhere. Emma's breathing grew shallow as she realized she was running out of time. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she refused to stop. The ocean felt colder now, as though it were swallowing her whole. Suddenly, one of the orcas shot out of the water beside her with terrifying speed. Emma gasped, barely able to react in time as the massive creature slammed into the side of the boat. The hull groaned and cracked under the impact, and Emma was thrown into the water with a gasp. She scrambled, trying to get her bearings, her heart racing in her chest. The boat, her only hope of survival, was now a wreck. It was sinking, the orcas having already dealt it a fatal blow. She looked around again, panic surging as she realized she was completely alone in the water, with nothing but the dark, cold ocean and the predatory creatures circling her. It was then that she heard the sound, a low, almost imperceptible rumble coming from beneath her. The water trembled as a second orca dove beneath her, its powerful body rushing just under the surface. The sound of its breath was close. Too close. Emma's eyes widened as she spotted the whale's enormous shadow below. It was coming up, and there was nowhere to go. She didn't have the strength to fight. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, feel her entire body shaking with fear. She had no weapon, no escape. The ocean had never felt so big. so unforgiving. Her instincts screamed at her to dive under the water, to put distance between herself and the orca, but it was too late. The massive form surged upward, its jaws parting wide as it rose from the depths. Emma's eyes went wide with terror as the orca's body loomed over her. But instead of attacking, it broke the surface with a sudden twist, splashing water in all directions. The pod had surrounded her once again, their calls echoing through the water, reverberating in her skull. Emma had no idea how much time had passed. Her mind was hazy with fear and exhaustion, her body numb from the cold. She had stopped swimming at some point, floating on her back, her eyes wide and unfocused. A voice pierced through the fog of panic and fear. There was someone else. It was a sound that couldn't belong to the orcas. Emma squinted, trying to focus through the blur of salt water in her eyes. She thought she saw the shape of a boat in the distance. A boat? No, it couldn't be. She tried to make herself visible, but the orcas were still there, still moving, their bodies just below the surface. "Help!" She screamed, her voice weak, but the sound seemed to disappear into the vast emptiness around her. Then, just as hope began to slip from her grasp, the distant roar of a helicopter cut through the air, faint but unmistakable. The orcas slowed, their movements more deliberate now. They weren't leaving, not yet. Emma knew she was running, out of time. She raised her arm, her shaking hand barely visible above the water, and shouted again, hoping beyond hope that the rescuers had seen her. "Please, help!" The helicopter grew louder, and Emma felt a spark of hope. The orcas began to circle again, but there was something different in their movement now. They seemed to be pulling away, their eyes tracking her with silent intelligence. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the helicopter descended, its shadow growing larger. The orcas, sensing the change, seemed to retreat, their massive bodies vanishing beneath the waves. For a moment there was silence. Then, with a sudden pull, the helicopter's rope dropped down. Emma reached for it with all the strength she had left. Emma's fingers fumbled for the rope that had just dropped from the helicopter. Her limbs felt as though they were made of lead, the cold seeping deeper into her bones with every second. The ocean had a vice grip on her body, and the only thing keeping her from slipping under was the frantic determination to survive. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely audible as she reached for the rope. The sound of the helicopter blades whipping through the air was deafening, but it gave her hope. Someone had seen her. Someone was coming to help. Her hand finally gripped the rope, the rough fibers digging into her skin. The warmth of the helicopter was just beyond her reach, a promise of safety, but the orcas were still there, circling. She could feel them even if she couldn't see them. The water around her shifted with their movements, the ripples spreading out from their powerful tails. She could hear their low, mournful calls cutting through the stillness. "Don't let go," she muttered to herself, her teeth chattering from the cold. She tried to pull herself up, but her arms felt weak, her strength drained by the hours of swimming and struggling in the freezing water. "Come on, you can do this," she hissed, gritting her teeth as she heaved herself higher on the rope. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she didn't have time to stop. She was so close now, she could feel the helicopter's heat radiating down toward her, its shadow casting a long, reassuring presence. The helicopter hovered above her, its rotors chopping the air with an almost deafening force. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "We see you, Dr. Carter. Hold on, we're pulling you up now." A rush of gratitude flooded through Emma as the helicopter's crew began pulling her up. But just as she felt herself being lifted from the water, a violent wave of movement below her sent a shockwave through the ocean. The orcas, sensing the change, surged forward, their black and white bodies rising from the water in quick succession. Emma could hear the rhythmic splashing of their tails beneath her, each strike a reminder of how little time she had left. The helicopter's winch groaned as it struggled to pull her upward against the pull of the water and the weight of the orcas below. Emma's hands were numb, her grip slipping. She clenched her teeth and hung on, her fingers cramping as the churning water raged beneath her. The rope jerked violently in her hands, and she gasped for air as the helicopter strained to lift her to safety. But then something happened that took her by surprise. One of the orcas, the largest one, broke the surface again, only this time, It wasn't swimming below her. It was directly beneath her, its huge body pushing the water up in great waves. Its eyes locked onto hers, its black pupils glistening with a cold, terrifying intelligence. "No, no," Emma whispered, her voice shaking. She was so close. She could feel the heat from the helicopter now, but it felt so far away, so unattainable. She could hear the orca's low, resonant call, a deep, almost mournful sound like a warning. The waves around her grew higher, and the orca began to circle beneath her. It was waiting, watching, and Emma could sense that this was no accident. She was the prey and they were the predators. "Get me up," she screamed, her voice hoarse from the salt water and fear. "Please, now." The helicopter's winch began to strain harder, pulling her higher, but the orca was relentless. With a sudden burst of speed, the whale surged toward her, its body rising from the depths with terrifying force. Emma's heart stopped as she saw the massive mouth of the orca open wide, its teeth glinting in the sun. "No, no, no, no!" she gasped as the orca came closer. The helicopter jerked again, pulling her higher just as the orca snapped at the rope, its powerful jaws missing her by inches. She could feel the rush of water as it passed, the terrifying force of the creature so close that it sent a shock through her entire body. "Come on, we're almost there." The voice from the helicopter radio crackled, the urgency in the pilot's voice barely masked by the static. Emma's arms were on fire, but she couldn't let go. She had to keep going, had to hold on. The rope tugged again and she felt herself rising faster now. The orcas were still circling, but they seemed to be retreating, moving away from her just as the helicopter drew her higher. Her eyes locked on the massive orca one last time. It was no longer charging. The pod had broken off, the giant predator, turning away, disappearing into the dark depths of the water as the helicopter began its ascent. With one final pull, Emma was yanked from the ocean. The rush of air hit her like a wall, and she gasped for breath as the helicopter's crew pulled her into the safety of the cabin. "Hold tight, Dr. Carter," the pilot said, his voice calm but filled with concern. He helped her inside the helicopter, guiding her to the seat, and Emma collapsed into it, her body trembling with exhaustion. Her legs wouldn't stop shaking as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Her breathing came in shallow, gasps as she looked down at the water below, still swirling with the remnants of the orca's presence. She could still hear the distant calls echoing in her mind, the sound of the ocean's predators circling, waiting. "You're safe now," the pilot said, his voice reassuring, but Emma could still hear the slight tremor in his tone. He wasn't just reassuring her. He was reassuring himself. The entire ordeal had lasted so much longer than anyone had anticipated, and the tension in the air was palpable as the helicopter flew steadily away from the water, the coastline of Vancouver Island, now coming into view. As they flew, Emma's mind raced. She couldn't shake the image of the orca's eyes, its unblinking stare as it watched her, calculating, waiting. She had been a part of their world, a world she had studied for years, but she had never understood the true nature of the ocean's predators until now. Orcas weren't just intelligent, they were strategic, aware of their surroundings in ways that were almost unfathomable. They were not mindless killers, but creatures who understood the dynamics of the world around them. The helicopter began to descend toward the beach where a rescue crew awaited. Emma closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing heart, but the image of the pod's dark bodies, rising and falling in the water, was burned into her mind. She could still feel the ocean, pressing against her, the weight of it, the danger. It had been so close. The helicopter touched down on the sand with a soft thud, and the doors swung open immediately. 2 paramedics rushed toward her, ready to assess her condition. But Emma, still trembling from the shock of what had happened, barely noticed them. As she was helped out of the helicopter, her eyes never left the water, the ocean that had nearly claimed her life. The paramedics were speaking to her, asking her questions, checking for signs of hypothermia, but Emma could barely hear them. Her mind was still lost in the ocean's depths, still haunted by the orca's eyes, the knowledge that she had come so close to becoming just another story told by those who survived. "Dr. Carter," one of the paramedics said, snapping her out of her reverie. "You're safe now. You're going to be okay." Emma's lips parted as she tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She just nodded, her body still shaking, as they guided her toward the waiting ambulance. For the first time, Emma allowed herself to look back at the water. The ocean was vast, its surface calm and serene, as if nothing had happened. But she knew better now. The ocean was never truly calm, and the predators it held, beautiful, terrifying, and intelligent, were always watching, always waiting. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the memory, but deep down, she knew it would never leave her. The ocean had claimed her once, and she had been lucky enough to escape. But the orcas would never forget her, and neither would she. The helicopter's roar began to fade as the distance between Emma and the ocean grew. Despite the relief of escape, the fear still gnawed at her, settling deep into her bones. Her body trembled uncontrollably, the aftershocks of the attack still surging through her. As the helicopter flew over the rugged coastline of Vancouver Island, Emma stared down at the water, still unable to shake the sensation that something was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for her to slip back. And the paramedics aboard the helicopter, having recognized her distress, spoke to her in calm, soothing tones. One of them, a woman with dark, concerned eyes, leaned closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Dr. Carter, we're almost to shore. You're safe now. We're just going to make sure you're okay." Emma nodded weakly, not trusting herself to speak. She could feel the salt water still clinging to her skin, the cold of the ocean seeping into her very soul. Her clothes were damp and heavy, and the pounding of her heart felt like an echo of the terror she had experienced in the water. The orca's eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, filled her thoughts, refusing to leave her. She could still hear the low calls of the pod, like a distant memory of something she would never forget. "You need to tell me, Emma." The paramedic's voice cut through her thoughts. "Are you feeling any pain? Hypothermia? Any injuries that we should know about?" Emma shook her head, unable to form words. Her throat was dry, tight with the lingering shock. She glanced over at the paramedic, whose face was a picture of professional concern, but Emma could see the fear in her eyes. They had all heard the stories about orca attacks, though they were rare, and no one had ever been quite so close to the animals for so long. I don't know," Emma whispered, the words coming out weak. The helicopter dropped lower, the beat of its blades thundering in the air as they neared the beach. Emma looked out the window again, her gaze drawn back to the ocean. The water was deceptively calm now, reflecting the pale blue sky above like a mirror, but it held a strange, almost oppressive weight. The memory of the pod's silent stalking filled her mind, and she felt her pulse quicken. "They're gone," the paramedic said, noting her gaze. "The orcas are gone, Dr. Carter. We're past them. You're safe now." "Are you sure?" Emma's voice cracked. "I don't think they're gone. I think they were waiting for me to let my guard down." The paramedic looked at her with a combination of pity and concern, but she didn't respond immediately. Emma could feel her heart beating louder now, the thudding in her chest matching the sound of the helicopter blades. "They don't attack people," the paramedic said, as if trying to reassure herself more than Emma. "They're not predators to humans. They could have killed you, but they didn't." Emma closed her eyes. The thought of it made her stomach turn. Orcas, by all accounts, weren't known for attacking humans in the wild. But she had been there, in the water, staring into the face of one of the ocean's most intelligent and powerful predators. She had felt the air shift, the quiet anticipation of something waiting. Her mind replayed the moment when the largest of the orcas had circled beneath her, eyes locked onto her own. It was too deliberate to be a coincidence. She clenched her fists, the tension in her body rising with every passing second. The paramedic kept speaking to her, asking more questions about her physical state, but Emma couldn't focus. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. She wanted to forget the dark eyes watching her, the massive bodies circling, the feeling of helplessness that had filled her every moment in the water. But she couldn't. The images, the sounds, they were lodged too deeply in her memory. "Dr. Carter?" The voice of the pilot broke through her spiraling thoughts. "We're coming in for a landing. You're going to be okay. Just keep breathing, all right? She nodded, taking in a shaky breath, trying to calm herself. Her muscles felt like they were made of stone, and she couldn't seem to shake the cold that had settled deep within her. The helicopter began its descent, and she felt a knot of relief form in her chest as they neared the shore. The moment the helicopter touched down on the soft sand, the paramedics quickly opened the door and helped her out. Her legs barely held her up, but they managed to guide her toward the waiting ambulance parked nearby. The sun was bright against the horizon, but Emma hardly noticed. The world around her seemed unreal, as though she were still caught between the ocean and the sky, a part of neither, a stranger to both. "Let's get you inside, Dr. Carter," the woman paramedic said gently, leading her toward the vehicle. "We need to check you over, make sure everything's all right." Inside the ambulance, Emma was hooked up to an IV, though she barely noticed the needle in her arm. The paramedic spoke quietly, assessing her for signs of shock or hypothermia. Emma barely responded, her mind still miles away, floating in the endless stretch of ocean. She had never felt so small, so insignificant. As the ambulance rumbled toward the local hospital, the tension in her chest tightened. The questions swirled in her head, impossible to quiet. What had really happened out there? Why hadn't the Orcas attacked her? She could still hear their calls, still feel their presence. The ocean had been calm when she was first in the water, but now it felt like it was taunting her, beckoning her back into its depths. At the hospital, Emma was checked over quickly by a team of doctors. They confirmed that she was physically fine. The effects of hypothermia were minimal, and the damage from her time in the water was mostly superficial. She had bruises from where she had struck the side of the boat, scratches from her frantic movements, but nothing serious. Still, her body was exhausted, racked with the physical and emotional toll of the experience. She was discharged later that evening, though the weight of the day's events hung over her like a storm cloud. She spent the night at a small cabin she had rented on the outskirts of the town, trying to rest, trying to process what had happened. But sleep came slowly, if at all. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Orca's massive body breaking through the surface, its eyes staring right through her. She saw the way it had circled her, the way the pod had stalked her in the water, waiting for a moment of weakness. She tried to convince herself that she was just being paranoid, that it was a fluke, that the Orcas had only been curious, not truly aggressive. After all, they had never attacked humans before, but there was something about the way they had moved, something about the intelligence in their eyes that made her question everything she thought she knew. By morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't escaped the ocean, that she was still trapped in its depths. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the small window at the water below. It was calm now, the shoreline stretching out in a peaceful arc, but she knew better. She had seen what was beneath the surface. The knock on the door startled her, and she quickly stood up to open it. A man in his early 40s stood there, a local journalist by the name of Mark Dawson. He had a gentle smile, but his eyes were filled with curiosity, and something else, something darker. "I'm sorry to intrude, Dr. Carter," he said, his voice polite but filled with intent. "I heard about what happened. I'm working on a story for the local paper. Would you mind talking to me for a few minutes?" Emma hesitated. Her first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to relive the horror of what had happened. But something about Mark's earnest expression made her pause. "I don't know if I'm in any condition to talk," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. I don't really understand what happened myself." Mark gave her a sympathetic nod as he sat down across from her. "I understand, but you're the first person to have survived such an encounter. People are going to want to know what you saw, what you experienced." Emma's eyes flickered to the window. The water was still out there, waiting. The silence in the room was thick with the weight of her thoughts. "I saw something," she said, her voice low and trembling. "Something I don't think anyone is ready for." Mark leaned forward, eager for more, but Emma wasn't sure if she was ready to speak the words out loud. She wasn't sure if she could, but the ocean was out there still and the Orcas were waiting. She could feel them even now, and she knew she would never be the same. Emma sat at the small table in her cabin, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of lukewarm tea, trying to steady her trembling fingers. She had spent the better part of the night lying awake, her thoughts a whirlwind of fragmented images and distant sounds. The orca's eyes were still with her, their weight pressing down on her chest. Every breath she took a reminder of what had happened in those frigid waters. The ocean, that vast, unforgiving expanse, felt like it was pulling her deeper into its depths where she couldn't escape, where the terror lingered. She hadn't spoken to anyone about the attack since Mark Dawson had left. She had given him a brief interview, mostly polite answers and vague explanations, but nothing about the encounter was easy to explain. She had tried to convince herself that what happened was just a rare, odd event, that the orcas had simply been curious. But every time she closed her eyes, the memory flooded back, those dark eyes, unblinking, watching her with a quiet intensity that made her skin crawl. The cabin felt suffocating now. The walls, once a comfort during her research, now felt like they were closing in on her. The silence was overwhelming, a constant reminder of her isolation. She wanted to leave, to get as far away from the water as possible, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. The ocean had marked her, had claimed her for itself, and no matter where she went, it would always be there waiting. The knock at the door startled her, and her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her hand froze in midair as she held her mug, and for a brief moment she thought about ignoring it. But then she heard the voice through the door. "Dr. Carter, it's Mark. I've got a few more questions if you're up for it." Emma sighed and put the mug down, her fingers leaving faint impressions in the wood as she stood up. She had no choice. He wouldn't go away until she spoke with him. She opened the door, and Mark stood there with a notepad in his hand, his expression one of quiet concern. His presence was a reminder that everything was still raw, still unresolved. "Morning," he said, his voice softer than it had been the day before. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't," Emma replied, stepping back to let him in. "I'm not sure I'm going to sleep again for a while." Mark nodded, understanding, but there was a glimmer of curiosity in his eyes. "I know you're probably sick of talking about it, but I need to ask a few more questions, if you're up for it." She didn't respond right away, instead walking back to the small kitchen area, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't sure if she wanted to relive what had happened. The words she had given him yesterday hadn't been enough, hadn't done justice to the fear that still clung to her like a second skin. She wasn't sure she could explain it. Not to him. Not to anyone. "I didn't get the full picture yesterday," Mark pressed gently, sitting down at the table. "I know it was intense, but I need to understand. What did you really see out there?" Emma closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Her throat felt tight. She couldn't shake the image of the orca's massive form, cutting through the water like a phantom, its eyes so close she could almost touch them. She had to speak, had to let the words out. They had to be said. "They were circling me," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "The pod. They weren't attacking, but they weren't just watching either. There was something deliberate in the way they moved. Like they were calculating, trying to understand me." She paused, running her fingers over the edge of the table. "And that one, the largest one, it was different. It didn't act like the others. It came closer. It studied me." Mark's eyes never left her face as she spoke. He was taking notes, but he wasn't writing down anything yet. He was listening, paying attention to every detail, to the way her hands shook as she recalled the memory. "What do you mean, studied you?" he asked, his voice low, coaxing her to continue. Emma exhaled slowly. It came so close that I thought I could see into its soul. Like it knew something I didn't. It wasn't attacking, but I felt like I was a target. Like they were waiting for the right moment." Her voice cracked slightly, and she wiped her eyes, feeling the familiar wave of panic surge in her chest. "I've been studying these animals for years, Mark. I know their behavior. But what I saw out there, it wasn't like anything I've read about. It was too intentional." Mark was quiet for a long moment, his pen hovering above his notepad. "You think it was an attack then?" "I don't know." Emma's voice was shaky and she took a deep breath to steady herself. "I don't know what to call it. I just know that if I hadn't gotten out of there when I did, I might not have survived. They were too focused, too coordinated. Orcas aren't supposed to act like that. They're supposed to be intelligent, right? Mark asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. You've spent your whole career studying them, but you've never seen anything like this? No, Emma replied firmly. I've never seen them act like that, not once, not in all my research. They hunt in packs, but they don't do this. They don't target humans, Mark, and they sure as hell don't watch like that. She rubbed her face with her hands, feeling the weight of the memory pressing down on her. I felt like prey, like they knew exactly what they were doing. Mark didn't speak for a while, and when he did, his voice was lower than before, tinged with a hint of concern. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe they were just curious, trying to figure you out. They're wild animals, after all. Sometimes they do things we don't expect. Emma shook her head vehemently. No, it wasn't curiosity. This wasn't just a mistake. The way they moved, the way they watched. That wasn't just curiosity. It was like they were trying to understand how I fit into their world. Like I was something to be studied, to be evaluated. Mark shifted in his seat, leaning forward, his eyes locked onto hers. But they didn't attack, right? You're here, alive. Isn't that proof they didn't mean you harm? Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry. They didn't kill me, but that doesn't mean they didn't want to. The room fell into a heavy silence, the only sound the soft hum of the nearby heater. Emma's mind raced as she relived those terrifying moments in the water. She could still feel the cold bite of the ocean, the pull of the waves beneath her, the orcas circling just out of reach. They hadn't attacked her, but they had tested her, like they were learning, waiting for the perfect moment. I don't know if I can explain it better than that, Emma said, finally breaking the silence. It wasn't an attack, not in the way we think of it, but it was something else. Something that shouldn't have happened. Mark nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. Maybe we're just not used to seeing them like this. Maybe it's a sign of something changing in their behavior. I mean, it could be that the environment is shifting, the food they rely on is harder to find. Who knows? Emma shook her head again. No. I've been tracking these pods for years. They don't change like that. Not like this. What I saw was something else. I get it, Mark said quietly. But what do we do with this? I mean, if we tell people, what happens then? Emma's hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She had no answers. She didn't even know if she wanted to share what had happened. The world didn't understand the ocean the way she did. The world didn't know what she had seen, what she had felt. She could hear the sound of the ocean's waves in her ears, the calls of the orcas echoing, a chilling reminder of the predator that waited just beneath the surface. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know if anyone will believe me. Mark's voice was soft but firm. I believe you, Emma. And maybe that's where we start. We start with the truth. But Emma wasn't sure the truth was something that could ever be fully told. Not when the ocean itself seemed to hold its secrets so tightly. The days that followed Emma's close call with the orca pod felt like a blur. Each passing moment seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the weight of the attack lingering, in her thoughts like a storm waiting to break. She had tried to return to a semblance of normalcy, throwing herself back into her work, but it was impossible to shake the sense that everything around her had shifted. The ocean, once a source of awe and fascination, now felt like an unpredictable, dangerous expanse, full of things she couldn't understand. Emma had kept to herself for the most part. Mark had tried to contact her several times after their conversation in the cabin, but she hadn't responded. The last thing she wanted was to relive the attack, to try to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. And yet, despite her attempts to push the memory aside, it clung to her like a shadow. The orca's eyes, their deliberate movements, the way they seemed to know something she didn't. They haunted her every waking moment. It was early morning when she decided to take another step forward, though she wasn't sure why. The thought of staying in the cabin, of hiding from the ocean, had become unbearable. It had been a week since the incident, and while her body had recovered, her mind had not. She needed to confront her fear, to face the ocean again, even if only for a moment. She drove to the beach where the helicopter had taken her that day, the place where the sand met the sea, and parked the truck with a soft crunch of gravel beneath the tires. The wind off the water was sharp, carrying the briny scent of the sea. And Emma pulled her jacket tighter around her as she stepped out of the truck. The shoreline stretched out before her, the waves gently lapping against the shore, the ocean calm and uninviting. But she knew better now. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the water's edge, her boots sinking into the wet sand. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, the same horizon that had seemed so vast and welcoming just a few weeks ago. Now, it felt like an endless void, a place where the unknown waited. She hesitated for a moment, feeling the sting of the cold wind against her face. But then she took another step forward, closer to the water. The waves pulled at her feet. The water cold, but not nearly as biting as it had been in the days following the attack. She stopped, watching as the sea surged and retreated, a reminder of the power it held. "Dr. Carter?" Emma turned at the sound of the voice, startled. Standing behind her was Mark, his face drawn with concern but also a hint of relief. He had been quiet for the last few days, no doubt giving her space, but she had known he would come eventually. It was almost impossible to keep something like what she had gone through hidden for long. "Mark," Emma said softly, her voice almost lost to the wind. She forced a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "What are you doing here?" "I came to make sure you were okay," he said, taking a few cautious steps toward her. "I wasn't sure if I'd hear from you again, but I felt like I should check in after what happened. I can't just leave you alone with it." Emma nodded, looking out at the water again. It was hard to find the words, especially with him standing there, watching her, waiting for her to explain. She wasn't ready for that, but she wasn't sure she could keep it all inside anymore either. "I'm not sure what I'm doing here," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could handle it, you know, but I can't. Every time I think about the ocean now, I feel like I'm drowning again. I can't escape it." Mark's gaze softened and he took another step closer. "You don't have to explain it all at once, but you can talk to me, Emma, if you want to." Emma closed her eyes, the weight of his words settling over her like a blanket, warm but suffocating. She could feel the pressure of the ocean's vastness, its emptiness, pressing against her. She knew what she had to do, but it was hard to accept. "I don't know what happened out there, Mark," she said, turning to face him fully. Her breath caught in her throat as she finally spoke the words that had been lingering, unspoken, since the moment she had been pulled from the water. "I don't know what those orcas were trying to do, but I can't forget it. It feels like they were testing me, like they wanted to see if I could survive. And that thought, it won't leave me." Mark nodded, his expression serious. "You're right. Orcas are intelligent. They know more than we give them credit for. But they're also wild, Emma. They're unpredictable. Maybe it was just a fluke." "A fluke?" Emma's voice trembled, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I've seen orcas before. They've never acted like that, never been so deliberate, so calculating. This wasn't a fluke, Mark. This was something else." Mark's eyes were filled with understanding, and he stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "What do you need? To be out here to face it or to leave it behind and move on?" Emma's gaze drifted back to the ocean. She could hear the distant calls of the seagulls, the crash of the waves against the rocks, the smell of the salt air, the constant pull of the water. It was familiar, comforting, but now it felt like a constant reminder of her vulnerability. "I need to know," she said, her voice steady now, though her heart pounded in her chest. "I need to know if I'm wrong, if I imagined it, because if I didn't, then I don't know what to do with it. I don't know how to go on with my work, with my life, if I can't trust what I saw." Mark took a step back, his hand still on her shoulder, but his eyes searching her face. "So, what are you saying? You want to go back out there into the water?" "I don't know." Emma took a shaky breath. "But I have to face it. If I don't, I'll always wonder." Mark was silent for a long moment, his gaze never leaving her face. Finally, he nodded. "All right. If that's what you need, I'll help. But only if you're sure. I'm not going to let you go out there alone." "I'm not sure of anything," Emma said softly, but the words held a finality that neither of them could deny. but I have to try." They stood there for a moment, the wind howling between them, and for the first time in days, Emma felt a small, tentative sense of peace. She wasn't sure what she was going to find, but she had made a decision, and in that moment it felt like the right one. The boat cut through the water with an eerie stillness as Emma and Mark made their way further from shore. It was a clear day, the sun shining down on the open sea, but there was a strange quiet in the air as though the world itself was holding its breath. Emma's hands were steady on the wheel, but inside her heart raced. Mark sat beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon, his jaw tight with worry. They hadn't spoken much since they'd set out. There wasn't much to say. They both knew why they were here, but neither of them was sure what to expect. The ocean stretched out before them, endless and dark beneath the surface, hiding secrets that no one would ever fully understand. "How far are we going?" Mark finally asked, breaking the silence. Emma glanced over at him, her expression serious. "Not too far. Just enough to see if anything's different." Mark nodded, though his concern was evident. "All right. Just be careful, okay?" "I will." Emma's voice was steady, but there was a tightness in her chest, a fear she hadn't expected to feel. She had done this hundreds of times before, studying marine life, tracking orca pods, but never like this. Never with the memory of what had happened, what she had survived, weighing so heavily on her mind. She kept the boat steady as they moved further into the open water. The farther they went, the quieter it became. The sounds of the engine and the gentle waves crashing against the hull seemed to fade, replaced by the soft hiss of wind in her ears. Then, just as she was starting to think that maybe nothing would happen, she saw it. A dorsal fin cutting through the water in the distance. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no mistaking it. "Mark," she whispered, pointing toward the water. "Look." Mark's eyes followed her gaze, his expression hardening. "Is that an orca?" Emma said, her voice low but filled with an unmistakable intensity. "It's one of them." The orca swam closer, its massive form moving through the water with the same grace Emma had remembered. But this time, there was no sense of wonder, no excitement. Just a deep, unsettling calm. The pod was here. And Emma was about to find out if her fears were justified. The sun had begun to dip behind the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across the water. The sky was turning a muted purple, the last light of the day slowly fading. Emma's heart was still racing as the boat drifted over the silent expanse of the ocean. She and Mark were surrounded by an unsettling quiet. The orca that had first appeared on the horizon was no longer in sight, but Emma felt an odd weight in the air. Something was different. The ocean wasn't the same as it had been before. She was no longer just studying it. It felt like she was part of it, bound to it in a way she hadn't been before. "Do you see them?" Mark asked, his voice low but laced with a mix of excitement and unease. His eyes were scanning the water, his body tense. Emma nodded slowly, keeping her eyes fixed on the water around them. "They're out there," she said, her voice tight. She wasn't sure if the orcas were still circling them, or if they had simply disappeared back into the depths, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air felt thick with anticipation, like something was about to break the surface. The boat bobbed gently in the water, rocking with the rhythm of the waves. Emma reached for her binoculars, lifting them to her eyes, scanning the distance. She didn't know what she was looking for, only that she needed to find it. Every instinct she had screamed that something was wrong. But what? "They're getting closer," she whispered, almost to herself. Mark looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Closer?" he asked, his voice betraying his own unease. "How do you know that?" Emma lowered the binoculars, her hands trembling. "I can't explain it, I just feel it. They're out there watching, and they're not leaving. Not yet." The hairs on the back of Mark's neck stood on end as he glanced around. The water around them was still almost unnervingly so. The sea, which had been so vast and full of life just days ago, now felt empty, like the world had gone silent. It was as if the ocean had stopped breathing. "Do you think they're waiting for something?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure if he wanted an answer, but the question hung in the air between them, thick with fear. Emma's mind raced. She had studied orcas for years, had tracked their movements, learned their patterns, but this felt different. The orcas were too still, too deliberate. It wasn't like anything she had experienced before. They were predators, yes, but they were also intelligent, capable of complex social behavior. This wasn't just about hunger. This was something else. I don't know, she admitted, but I think they're waiting for something. Or maybe someone. Maybe it's me. Mark swallowed hard. You? Why would they? I don't know, Mark. Emma cut him off, her voice shaking with a mix of frustration and fear. I don't know. All I know is that I've never felt this way before. It's like they're trying to understand me, to figure me out. The silence stretched between them, the boat rocking gently as they both tried to make sense of the situation. Emma could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the fear from the first encounter creeping back into her mind. The orca's eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes, had been burned into her memory, and she couldn't forget the way they had watched her, studied her, as if they had been waiting for her to make a mistake. Mark looked at her, his face creased with concern. We can turn back, you know. We don't have to do this. We can go back to shore. You've already seen enough, Emma. You're still shaken up from last time. This is insane. Emma stared at him, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She wanted to turn back. She wanted to get away from the ocean, from the orcas, but she couldn't. Not yet. She had to know. She had to face whatever was out there lurking beneath the surface before she could ever move on. I can't go back, she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet determination. Not until I know for sure. I have to know if what I felt out there was real. If I was just imagining it, or if they were truly targeting me. Mark opened his mouth to argue, but he stopped himself, seeing the look in her eyes. It was the same look she had had when they first set out. The same unshakable determination that had driven her to study these creatures in the first place. Emma wasn't just a scientist. She was a woman who needed answers, who couldn't rest until she had them. All right, Mark said, his voice quiet. But we're doing this carefully. I'm not letting you go out there alone, Emma. Not after everything that's happened. Emma nodded, grateful for his understanding. But the truth was that nothing Mark could say would stop her. She had already made up her mind. The orcas were out there and she had to face them. She had to understand what they wanted, what they had been trying to tell her, even if it meant putting herself back in danger. The minutes stretched into hours as they drifted further out into the water. Emma's eyes never left the surface, her gaze scanning the distance, waiting for the first sign of movement. She felt like she was being pulled deeper into the ocean, into a world she didn't fully understand but couldn't escape. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger, and every ripple in the water made her pulse quicken. And then, it happened. A massive black and white form broke the surface, its dorsal fin cutting through the water like a knife. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she spotted the first orca, its sleek body gliding smoothly through the waves. It was followed by another and then another, each one moving in perfect unison. The pod was here and they weren't leaving. There they are, Emma whispered, her voice a mixture of awe and terror. It's them. It's the same pod. Mark's eyes widened as he followed her gaze, his body tense with fear. They're too close. They're coming right for us. The boat rocked violently as the first orca breached the water just a few feet away from them. Emma's hand flew to the throttle, but she didn't dare speed off. She wasn't running anymore. She had to face them, had to understand what was happening. The orca swam closer, its eyes locking onto Emma's. It was the same one that had circled her in the water, the largest, the most deliberate. This time there was no curiosity in its gaze. There was something else, something primal. Why are they doing this? Mark asked, his voice shaking. Why are they coming toward us like this? Emma didn't have an answer. She was too focused on the orca's eyes, too captivated by the way it moved. Its movement so fluid and purposeful. It wasn't just swimming, it was studying her. They're not attacking, Emma whispered more to herself than to Mark. They're watching. The orca circled them, its sleek body cutting through the water with terrifying speed. The other members of the pod followed, their movements synchronized, each one moving in perfect harmony. Emma's gaze never wavered from the massive creature that seemed to be leading the charge. There was something about the way it moved, the way it commanded the others, that sent a shiver down her spine. Mark was silent beside her, but Emma could feel his unease, his growing panic. He wanted to run, wanted to escape, but Emma couldn't make herself move. She couldn't look away from the orca. There was something hypnotic about the way it moved, as if it were speaking to her, as if it were trying to communicate something she didn't understand. For a long moment there was nothing but the sound of the water, the soft splash of the orcas' tails, and the steady hum of the boat's engine. The orcas circled, never getting too close, but always just within reach. Their eyes locked onto Emma's with an unnerving intensity. And then with a sudden burst of movement, the pod broke apart. The orcas dove beneath the surface, disappearing into the depths of the ocean as quickly as they had appeared. Emma exhaled shakily, her breath ragged in her chest. She could still feel their presence, their eyes watching her even though they were gone. She felt a sense of loss, of emptiness, as if something had been taken from her. "They're gone," Mark said, his voice barely audible. "But I don't know what just happened." Emma didn't respond right away. She was still staring at the empty water, her mind racing. Had it all been real? Had the orcas truly been trying to communicate with her, to understand her? Or had it been a figment of her imagination, a desperate attempt to find meaning in something she couldn't explain? "Maybe we'll never know," Emma whispered, her voice filled with a strange, quiet sadness. "But I think they wanted something from me. I think they wanted me to understand them." Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and sympathy. "And did you?" Emma turned her gaze back to the horizon, the last light of the day fading into the darkness. She wasn't sure. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. But for the first time, she felt like she might be getting closer to the truth. And that, at least, was enough. The weight of the past few days had settled over Emma like a thick fog. Despite the thrill of discovering the truth behind the orca pod's strange behavior, a lingering sense of dread clung to her. The coastline of Vancouver Island now seemed less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. A place where the ocean's mysteries had come too close, where the boundary between her world and theirs had blurred in a way she could never undo. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that she wasn't just a witness to something extraordinary. She was part of it somehow, marked by the ocean itself. Emma found herself on the shore again, but this time she wasn't facing the vast expanse of the sea. She stood at the base of a cliff overlooking the water, the sharp, jagged rocks below jutting out like the teeth of some ancient predator. The waves crashed violently against the rocks, the sounds a constant reminder of the power the ocean held. Over her, the power she couldn't escape. Mark had left a few days ago, the weight of their shared experience still lingering in the air between them. He'd gone back to his family, but Emma couldn't bring herself to leave. The thought of going back to the routine of her life, back to her research, seemed like a distant memory. Everything had changed, and she wasn't sure if she could go back to who she had been before. She stared out at the water, her eyes following the rhythm of the waves, the crashing sound like a pulse, steady and unrelenting. The ocean was calm now, eerily so, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There had to be something she had missed, some detail that would explain why the orcas had acted the way they had, why they had targeted her and not anyone else. She wasn't sure if it was instinct or just the weight of too many sleepless nights, but something pulled her down to the beach. The sound of her boots crunching against the gravel felt loud in the otherwise silent air. As she walked along the shoreline, she realized how much the ocean had consumed her thoughts, how much it had changed her perception of everything. "Emma?" The voice came from behind her, cutting through the silence like a knife. It was familiar, a voice she hadn't expected to hear again. She turned quickly, surprised to see Mark standing at the edge of the beach, his expression guarded but sincere. He looked tired, his face lined with the exhaustion of a man who had carried the weight of their shared experience long after the event had ended. "Mark," she said, her voice cracking slightly, though she wasn't sure why. She hadn't expected him to come back, and for a moment, she wasn't sure what to feel. Relief? Anger? Confusion? I thought I might find you here, he said, taking a few steps closer. I wanted to check on you. You've been quiet. I haven't heard from you since I left. Emma nodded, her eyes drifting back to the ocean. She had been quiet. Too quiet. It had been easier to avoid everyone, to bury the feelings that had come with the encounter. The orcas, the way they had surrounded her, the intensity of their presence. It was all still too raw. She wasn't sure if she could talk about it again, even with Mark. I've been thinking about everything, Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. About what happened, about what they wanted from me. She paused, looking at the waves crashing against the shore. I don't understand it. I keep asking myself if it was just a fluke, or if I imagined it. Mark's expression softened. As he took another step toward her, his eyes searching hers. Emma, you're not imagining it. I saw it in your eyes when it happened. You weren't just being paranoid. You felt something out there. Something I couldn't explain either. But it wasn't just in your head. She glanced at him, her eyes searching for reassurance she didn't know she needed. Then what was it, Mark? Why did they come after me? Why did they watch me like that? She paused, the words catching in her throat. Why was it so personal? Mark hesitated, unsure how to answer. He ran a hand through his hair, his gaze shifting to the ocean. I don't know, Emma. Maybe they saw you as an outsider. Or maybe they saw something in you that they needed to understand. But whatever it wasn't just an accident. It was like they were testing you. Emma closed her eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on her. It wasn't just her imagination then. The orcas had been testing her, pushing her to see how far she would go, how much she could withstand. She had always thought of orcas as creatures of beauty and intelligence, but now she wasn't so sure. They weren't just animals. They were something more, something dangerous and unknowable. They weren't trying to kill me, Emma said, her voice barely audible. But they weren't trying to help me either. They wanted something, but I don't know what. Mark's eyes darkened, and he took another step closer, his voice low. What if they weren't just trying to figure you out, Emma? What if they were trying to tell you something you haven't understood yet? Emma's breath caught in her throat. She looked at him, her eyes wide. Tell me something? He nodded. I've been thinking about it. The way they moved. The way they acted. It wasn't like anything I've ever seen in nature. They were behaving intelligently, not just for food. There was a purpose to it. Maybe they were showing you something, warning you about something. Emma shook her head, the thought swirling in her mind. A warning? What could they possibly warn me about? They're just animals. Wild, yes, but animals. I don't know, Mark said, his voice filled with uncertainty. But something about this feels different. Maybe we're missing the bigger picture here. What if this isn't just about orcas? What if the ocean is trying to tell us something? About the world we don't understand? About things we've ignored? Emma stared at him, her mind racing. She had always seen the ocean as a place of study, a vast, untapped source of knowledge and wonder. But now, it felt like something else, a force far beyond her comprehension, something ancient and unyielding. I don't know what to think anymore, Emma whispered. It's all too much. I can't escape it, Mark. The ocean is in me now. I can feel it every time I close my eyes. I can hear their calls, even when they're not there. Mark stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to go through this alone. Whatever it is, we can figure it out together. But I think you need to face this, not just for your research, but for yourself. If you don't, it'll eat you up from the inside. Emma swallowed hard, feeling the pressure of his words settle over her. She had never thought of it that way before. The orcas had been a catalyst, a turning point. They had forced her to confront something far greater than her work, something that had been buried deep inside her for years. The need for understanding, for control, for an explanation. She turned to look at the ocean again, her mind still, grappling with everything she had learned, everything she had felt. What if I'm not meant to understand it, Mark? What if the ocean has nothing to give me but silence and danger? Mark's eyes softened, and he gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Then maybe the answer isn't in the ocean, but in how you choose to face it. Whatever it is, you're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together. Emma closed her eyes taking a deep breath. The weight of the ocean still pressed down on her, but there was something in Mark's words, something in the way he stood by her, that made her feel like maybe she wasn't as lost as she thought. She had always been driven by the search for answers, but maybe the real answer wasn't in the ocean. Maybe it was in herself. How she could adapt to the unknown, how she could face her fears, and how she could move forward no matter how uncertain the path ahead seemed. The wind howled around them, but for the first time in days, Emma felt a small flicker of hope. It wasn't the ocean's answers she needed. It was her own. "I think I'm ready to go back," Emma said, her voice steady. "But not to where I started. I need to find something new." Mark smiled, a mixture of relief and support in his eyes. "Then let's go, Emma. Let's figure it out together." As they turned to leave, Emma felt a weight lift from her shoulders, even if just slightly. The ocean still held its mysteries, but she no longer felt like it was something to fear. It was a force, yes, but it was one she could face, one step at a time. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Emma sat on the edge of the boat, her fingers gripping the railing as she stared out into the open ocean. The horizon stretched endlessly before her, a line of dark blue meeting a pale, cloud-covered sky. The steady hum of the engine was the only sound, and even it felt too loud in the vast emptiness around her. She had spent the last several days thinking about what had happened, replaying the events over and over in her mind, and yet she still didn't have the answers she needed. The orcas had returned. She had seen them again. This time, they had moved closer, their fins slicing through the water like shadows. It was as if they were waiting for her, tracking her every movement, even when they weren't in sight. Each time they appeared, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were not just passing by, but watching, calculating, and waiting for something. She felt Mark's presence beside her, though he hadn't spoken much since they set out that morning. He sat across from her now, his eyes scanning the water, his face tight with concern. He had been with her since the beginning, but Emma could feel the weight of his worry, the same fear that had begun to settle deep in her own chest. "Are you okay?" Mark finally asked, his voice low, cutting through the quiet between them. Emma nodded, though it wasn't entirely true. She hadn't been okay for days. The nights were the hardest, filled with dreams she couldn't remember but always woke from in a cold sweat. And the days, well, they were just as difficult. The fear hadn't faded. It was different now, though. It was quieter, more insidious, creeping into every thought and action. "I'm fine," she said, forcing the words out, though they felt hollow. She had learned to keep a facade up for Mark, to show him she was still strong, still capable of facing whatever came next. But in the back of her mind, she could still feel the ocean's pull, the weight of the orca's gaze, the deep sense that they were trying to communicate with her in ways she couldn't understand. The boat cut through the water steadily, and Emma shifted, leaning back on the bench as she ran a hand through her hair. The wind was picking up now, carrying the salty spray of the sea, the mist swirling around them as they traveled farther from the shore. Emma watched as the coastline began to recede behind them, the cliffs now just a dark line on the horizon. She had made the decision to push further out into the open ocean. She had to understand the truth of what was happening. She had to see if the orcas would approach again. What if they're not the ones who need answers? Mark's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to him, startled by the quiet certainty in his tone. "What do you mean?" Emma asked, her voice hoarse from the salt in the air. Mark looked at her, his eyes steady. "What if it's us? What if they're not trying to hurt us, but show us something? Teach us something?" Emma stared at him, the words sinking in slowly. She wasn't sure what to make of them. She had been so focused on what the orcas had been doing, on their behavior, that she hadn't thought about why they were acting the way they were. But Mark's question hit something deep inside her. She had always believed that the ocean, with its vastness and complexity, held more answers than people could comprehend. Maybe the orcas weren't a threat. Maybe they were just misunderstood. "I don't know what they want, Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "They've been following us for days now, moving closer every time. It's like they're trying to tell me something, but I don't know what it is. I don't know if I'm meant to understand it." Mark nodded, his expression serious. Maybe that's the problem. You're trying to force an understanding that isn't meant to be understood yet. Maybe you're meant to just experience it. Emma looked at him, surprised by the depth of his words. Experience it, she repeated, her voice incredulous. What does that even mean? I can't just experience something like this. It doesn't work that way. Mark leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her. I think it does. I think maybe the Orcas aren't trying to hurt us. They're trying to show us a different way of seeing the world. Maybe they've been watching us, studying us too. Maybe they've been trying to get us to stop looking at them like they're just animals and start seeing them for what they really are. Intelligent, complex creatures with their own way of seeing the world. Emma sat back, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. She hadn't considered that angle before. She had been so focused on her own fear, on the danger the Orcas might represent, that she hadn't stopped to think about what they were trying to communicate. What if Mark was right? What if they were just trying to show her something? What if they were, in some strange, inexplicable way, trying to teach her something that she had missed? But the thought made her uneasy. She wasn't sure she could trust her own perceptions anymore. She didn't know if she could believe that the Orcas had benign intentions. The memory of the first encounter, their eyes, so cold and calculating, still lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, analyzed even now. I don't know, Mark, she said, her voice uncertain. I don't think I can just let go of what happened. It wasn't like anything I've ever seen before. They were moving too deliberately, too purposefully. It wasn't just curiosity. It felt dangerous. Mark looked at her, his face softening. I get it, I do. But I think you have to let go of the fear. I think that's what they want you to do. They're showing you something that might be too big for us to understand right now. But if we keep looking at them through the lens of fear, we'll never see it. Emma felt a chill run through her. Mark's words echoed in her mind, and for the first time, she started to wonder if he was right. Maybe the Orcas weren't the ones who needed to change. Maybe it was her, the way she had viewed them, the way she had been unwilling to accept that they might be more than just a species to be studied. The boat continued to cut through the waves, the rhythm of the water a constant background to the storm of thought swirling in Emma's mind. She looked out over the ocean, trying to clear her head. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe she had to stop looking at the Orcas as a threat and start looking at them as something more. A species with its own intelligence, its own purpose. Suddenly, the water in front of them began to churn. Emma's heart skipped a beat as the Orca's dorsal fin broke the surface, cutting through the water like a dark shadow. It was close. Too close. Emma's hand gripped the edge of the boat, her breath catching in her throat. There was no mistaking it now. The Orcas were here and they were not leaving. This time, they had come for something, and Emma wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. But she had no choice. The moment of confrontation had arrived. As the first Orca rose from the depths, its massive body slicing through the water with terrifying elegance, Emma realized something. She didn't have to fear them. She didn't have to control them. The Orcas were part of the ocean, part of the world that existed beyond her understanding. And in that moment, she realized that maybe it wasn't about understanding at all. Maybe it was about accepting the unknown. We're not alone, Mark whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the waves. Emma nodded slowly, watching as the pod moved closer, their sleek bodies gliding through the water like phantoms. She had come here to find answers. And maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to understand that the answer wasn't in the Orcas at all. It was in her own willingness to let go, to let the ocean teach her, without needing to force an explanation. For the first time, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. The Orcas weren't a threat. They weren't a mystery to solve. They were simply part of the world, and the world wasn't something that could be easily explained. And maybe, for now, that was enough. The morning light broke through the thick canopy of clouds, casting long shadows across the water. Emma leaned against the railing of the boat, watching the sea, her mind still heavy with the weight of the past few days. The Orcas had gone, disappeared into the depths after their final encounter with her, but the feeling of their presence lingered like a ghost, always just out of reach. It had been a week since that last moment, and though she was back on the water, The peace she had once felt when studying the ocean felt distant now. Mark had left early that morning, his part in her journey complete. He had been a grounding presence, always steady and supportive. But she knew it was time for him to go. She had to face this alone now. She had to make sense of what had happened, not just with the orcas, but with herself. The boat rocked gently as Emma sat on the edge, staring at the horizon. The vast expanse of water stretched before her, endless and unknown. She thought about the way the orcas had moved, the deliberate nature of their behavior, and the deep, unsettling connection she had felt in the water with them. She thought about how they had circled her, their eyes never leaving hers as though they were searching for something. And she thought about the way she had felt in their presence, a mix of fear, awe, and something else, something harder to name. Was it possible that she would never fully understand it? The orcas had never attacked her. They had never meant her harm. They had simply watched, observed, and yet there was something about their gaze that had made her feel small, insignificant, like an object under their scrutiny. It was an experience that had shaken her to the core, leaving her with more questions than answers. Her fingers gripped the edge of the boat tighter, her nails digging into the wood. She needed to do something. She needed to take the next step, but she wasn't sure where to go from here. Emma? The voice behind her pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to see an older man standing at the back of the boat, his hands braced on the railing. He was a fisherman, someone she had spoken with during her time here, someone who knew the ocean better than anyone. His name was Tom, and he had offered her a place on his boat after she had asked around for information about orcas in the area. Tom had been kind to her, but there was always an underlying tension when they spoke. It was as though he knew more about the orcas than he let on. "Tom," Emma said, standing up and wiping her hands on her jacket. "You're up early. What's on your mind?" Tom gave her a crooked smile, the lines on his face deep from years of working the water. He had a rugged air about him, like someone who had seen more than his share of danger on the sea. He was holding a cup of coffee, the steam rising into the cool morning air. "Just checking on you," he said, taking a sip of his drink. "I've been seeing the orcas around lately. Thought you might want to know. Haven't seen them this close in a while." Emma's pulse quickened. She hadn't expected the orcas to return. Not so soon. Not after what had happened. She had thought they would move on, disappear back into the depths and leave her with only the memories of their strange, unsettling behavior. "Are they still out there?" she asked, her voice tight. Tom nodded. "Yeah, a couple of them. I've been keeping my distance, but they've been circling the same area for a while now. Not sure what they're after." Emma stood still for a moment, her mind racing. She had come out here hoping to find answers, but now that the orcas were so close again, she wasn't sure what to do. She had been avoiding the ocean's call, avoiding the creatures that had haunted her thoughts, but now it seemed like there was no escaping it. The ocean had a way of pulling you back in whether you were ready or not. "I need to see them again," Emma said suddenly, her voice firm. Tom looked at her, eyebrows raised. "Are you sure about that? Last time, you looked like you'd seen a ghost." "I need to understand," Emma said, her voice quiet but determined. "I've been running from it, trying to make sense of it in my head, but the answers aren't in my head. They're out there, with them. I have to see them again." Tom didn't respond immediately. He took another sip of his coffee, watching her carefully. "I can take you out there, but you have to promise me something. Don't go looking for trouble. Orcas are powerful, and they're not something you want to mess with. If they get too close, you pull back. Understand?" Emma nodded, her expression serious. "I understand." Tom motioned for her to follow him as he moved to the boat's controls. She stepped up beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. The engine rumbled to life, and the boat started moving slowly forward, the sound of the motor cutting through the quiet morning. The air felt thick with anticipation, the water calm but heavy with the weight of what was to come. As they moved further out, Emma couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping back in. She had told herself she was ready, that she could face the orcas again, but now that she was out here, so close to the waters where they had appeared before, she wasn't so sure. What if they didn't come this time? What if they didn't want To see her again? But then, as if on cue, the water in front of them began to shift. A dark shape appeared beneath the surface, moving steadily, cutting through the water with ease. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the dorsal fin immediately. It was one of the orcas, and it was heading straight for them. "There," Tom said quietly, pointing toward the shape in the water. "Looks like they're coming to meet us." Emma's heart raced as she watched the orca break the surface, its massive body arching out of the water before it plunged back down, the dark silhouette disappearing beneath the waves. It was followed by another, and then another. The pod had arrived, and Emma's hands clenched at her sides as she watched them move through the water, their sleek bodies gliding like shadows beneath the surface. The boat slowed as the orcas swam closer, their fins cutting through the water with eerie precision. Emma's breath was shallow as she leaned forward, her eyes fixed on them. She couldn't look away. "They're watching us," she whispered, her voice a mix of awe and fear. "They're so close." Tom said nothing, his gaze fixed on the water. The orcas were close now, circling them, their bodies gliding through the water with such effortless grace that it was almost impossible to believe they were the same creatures that had once terrified her. There was no aggression in their movements, no sign of hostility, but the intensity of their presence was unmistakable. It was like they knew exactly what they were doing, exactly why they had come. Emma felt her heart pounding in her chest, but this time it was different. There was no panic, no fear of being hunted or attacked. Instead, she felt something else, something deeper. She felt connected to the orcas, like she was part of their world, part of the rhythm of the ocean that flowed around them. "They're not here to hurt us," she said, more to herself than to Tom. "They're here to show us something, to teach us." Tom glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Maybe you're right. But don't forget, they're wild. Beautiful, yes, but wild." Emma nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving the orcas as they swam around the boat. She didn't know what it was that they wanted her to see. She didn't know if she would ever understand their behavior fully. But in that moment, she didn't need to. She was no longer afraid. She was simply there, watching them, understanding them in a way she never had before. As the orcas continued to circle the boat, Emma let herself breathe. The ocean was vast, and its mysteries were infinite, but she no longer felt like a stranger to it. She was part of it, part of something much larger than herself, and that, she realized, was enough. The orcas slowly disappeared beneath the waves, their fins cutting through the surface one last time before they were gone. Emma stayed still for a moment, letting the silence settle over her like a blanket. It was as if the ocean itself had breathed a sigh of relief, as if it too had found peace. Tom started the engine again, and they turned back toward shore, the horizon growing closer with each passing minute. Emma sat back, her mind finally quiet, the weight of the past few days lifting from her shoulders. She didn't have all the answers, and maybe she never would, but for the first time she didn't need to know everything. The ocean had given her something more valuable than answers. It had given her peace, and for now, that was enough.